Turkey is poised to hold an election that could prove decisive, not only for the country's democracy, but also for Europe and the Middle East, and most especially for the leader who's been in power for the past 20 years. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is facing his most contested election ever, with a very real chance of defeat. Some voters are put off by the president's increasingly authoritarian rule, but for many, it's the economy. Corruption, mismanagement, and record-high inflation are prompting new support for the opposition coalition aligned behind Kemal Kilicdaroglu. So we're asking, elections in Turkey, Erdogan's moment of truth? Hello and welcome to The Point. It is a pleasure to introduce our guests, starting with Julia Hahn, who reports for DW from Istanbul and is joining us remotely from Turkey. I'm also very pleased to welcome Dilek Kurban. She is teaching and researching at the University of Copenhagen on human rights, and she also formerly headed the democratization program at the Turkish Foundation for Economic and Social Studies, and also wrote for Turkish media. And finally, a great pleasure to welcome Can Dündar. He's the former editor-in-chief of the Turkish daily Cumhuriyet, now living in exile here in Germany and producing documentaries, amongst others, for DW. Let me start, if I may, with you, Can. The Erdogan regime sentenced you to 27 years in prison in absentia, and they recently put you on a list of most wanted terrorism suspects. So what are you feeling as you look toward this election that potentially could unseat Erdogan?
I have a kind of cautious optimism about the results. I'm optimistic because I believe in the power of the people, but I'm cautious because I know Erdogan and how he is capable of what, he will do his best to stay in power.
Exactly. No one knows better than you that he doesn't stop at putting the entire power of the state behind efforts to destroy those who block him. So would you really expect him to take a defeat and go?
Yeah, we know from the US experience, for example, with Trump or, Bolsonaro in Brazil. So those kind of guys, they never want to leave the power peacefully.
And Dilek, of course, certainly past elections have been rigged. Why would we expect this one to be free and fair?
Well, I think we need to, if we look at the last elections that we had in Turkey, which were very critical, the 2019 local elections, there were, of course, also attempted, Erdogan and his regime tried to rig. Worse yet, they didn't actually accept defeat because İmamoğlu, the opposition's candidate, won the municipality of Istanbul, which was a big defeat for Erdogan because he used to be the mayor of Istanbul himself at the beginning of his political career. The difference between İmamoğlu, the opposition candidate, and his rival, Erdogan's candidate, was only 13,000. And then the elections were repeated unlawfully, and the margin then became 800,000. So İmamoğlu was re-elected. That stands, Erdogan's attempt not to accept the results of a democratic election mobilized many people who went to the ballots, and some of them changed sides, to show support for democracy. And this time, I think we should not underestimate the opposition also. The opposition parties, all of them, have gained considerable expertise and experience in protecting the balance. They are ready for that night. No one is going to sleep. And plus, there's citizen mobilization. There are citizens that are going to be witnesses at the ballots. They're going to be there to watch the counts of the results, etc. I think we have enough reasons to be optimistic on that front.
So in a way, you're giving us the political science reinforcement of what Can told us, that you believe in the people, the voters themselves. Let me go over to Julia in Istanbul. In an interview recently with you, the opposition candidate Kilicdaroglu said, "We will bring democracy to this country, and it won't only be seen here in Turkey, but in the world." What does this election mean to the world? Why should our voters, whether they're watching in Europe, the US, the Americas, Africa, Asia, why should they care about this election?
Well, Melinda, I would argue these elections are the most important elections globally in 2023, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Sunday's vote will determine how Turkey will be governed in the future. Will there be a return to parliamentary democracy, or can Erdogan extend his rule into a third decade under an almost all-powerful presidency? The vote will also determine where the country's economy is headed. Will there be more market-friendly approaches, or can Erdogan continue his very controversial unorthodox economic policies? And then, of course, foreign policy. The opposition woes to end years of strained relations with key Western partners, the US, the EU, NATO. And we're talking about Turkey, right? A geostrategic powerhouse, a NATO member. So the opposition and the government, they are offering very different visions for the future of Turkey, and voters have to make a tough decision here.
And we want to take a look at exactly that. Let's take a look at the duel between two candidates who could scarcely be more different.
President Erdogan has been in power for 20 years. He started his political career as a bearer of hope and innovator. Today, the opposition and even former supporters hold the 69-year-old responsible for Turkey's transformation into a repressive one-man state. Erdogan has been continuously using harsh and polarizing rhetoric against opponents. Mr. Kemal, drink as much as you want. My nation will not give the floor to an alcoholic, a drunk. He is referring to the leader of the CHP, Kemal Kilicdaroglu, who, with his calm and reserved demeanor, is the opposite of Erdogan and also his fiercest competitor. He heads an alliance of 6 parties and has already survived 2 assassination attempts. Still, he preaches unity and reconciliation. I won't discriminate. I will embrace all 85 million Turkish people. The avowed Alevi promises his voters an end to despotism, corruption and nepotism, which he already denounced in 2017 with an over 400-kilometer march for justice from Ankara to Istanbul. Erdogan or Kilicdaroglu? Who will win the hearts and votes of the Turkish people?
And let me pass that question straight to Yulia, because, in fact, you have been talking to voters and you've also been accompanying the opposition candidate as he campaigns. He is currently leading in the polls. What would you say when you talk to the voters? How does he stack up against Erdogan?
Well, you know, Mr. Kilicdaroglu has actually made the heart his signature gesture. He's holding up his hands in a heart shape. And as you mentioned, he has a narrow lead in the polls. And speaking to people, looking at the figures, of course, he could really pull off what was long considered here in the country. He could indeed manage to beat President Erdogan in a first round or a second round, a runoff 2 weeks later. He's currently polling between 45 to 55%, and a candidate to win the presidential vote needs at least 50% of the votes. But let me also remind our voters, our viewers, that President Erdogan still has the support of many religious conservative voters here in the country. There are many people who tell me they believe he's the only man who can hold this country together, who can run it effectively. And it's going to be a tight race.
Can speak to that point as well, if you like. But I'd like to ask you about what we heard in the report, where Erdogan is essentially playing the hate card, seeking to polarize the electorate. He's also been playing the fear card. He's said that Mr. Kilicdaroglu would let terrorists out of jail, would turn the Turkish people into LGBTers, whatever that means. Do you think such polarizing tactics can win voters still?
It worked very well for the last 2 decades, and that's why this is the card he's been using to consolidate his power. And, of course, this polarization and hate campaign helped him a lot in the especially last 5 years. But I guess the people were really fed up with it. now, and they need someone who embraces all the nation. And the name of the guy is Kılıçdaroğlu, I guess.
Dilek, I'd like to just deconstruct the hearts and minds question a bit, namely whose hearts and minds seem to be going to which candidate. It is sometimes said that the Kurdish vote could prove absolutely key for these elections. Would you agree? And where is it going to go?
Yes, and that's, past experience in the past few elections show that the Kurdish party has become the kingmaker in elections. And this time, first of all, they did not show their own candidate. Second of all, they have wholeheartedly supported Kılıçdaroğlu. And you can see in the polls that the Kurdish cities in the Kurdish region have some of the highest rates of support for Kılıçdaroğlu in the whole country. There are two more groups, though, socially speaking. Youth, 5.3 million people will vote for the first time in these elections. And Kılıçdaroğlu has been very smart in addressing them directly. So they will determine the outcome of the elections very significantly, and then women. And here, particularly pious women, Muslim, practicing Muslims who used to be in Erdogan's base, but Erdogan has, in his panic to reach out to, new parties to expand his alliance, made, in my opinion, critical mistakes by reaching out to two Islamist, fundamentalist political parties that are already threatening to take back some of the gains that women have had, which of course also affects the pious women. Plus, of course, Yulia mentioned the economy is doing really bad, and it's women that really see the effect of that. Yeah. So I think it will be the youth, women, plus, of course, the Kurds, as always. They're going to determine the outcome of these elections. We're
going to come back to the economy in a moment, but let's talk about the young people. 13 million of the 64 million Turks eligible to vote are under 25 years old. Let us hear a few of their voices, as reported by Yulia Han, who was out on the streets talking to young people.
I would like to see a democratic Turkey where people are doing well economically and have more human rights. I want people to be more tolerant and learn to accept each other with all their differences. There are so many of us who really want to see change. This election might be our last chance.
And Yulia, as I mentioned, you did speak to those young people. Do you think sentiments like the ones that we heard there could prove decisive in this election?
I think they could be very decisive. If we look at the polls, a majority of young people want change. They are unhappy with how the economy is being governed. They're unhappy with their future prospects. They also strongly oppose clampdowns on lifestyles, democratic rights and freedoms. This is according to the data we have. And then, of course, Kemal Kilicdaroglu and Recep Tayyip Erdogan are both much older than the young voters they're trying to sway. But I think what we've seen in Kılıçdaroğlu's campaign, he's really strategically using social media to address young voters, often from his modest kitchen table at home. He is basically telling them, look, I'm here for you. I'm going to solve your problems. And these videos are very popular among young voters.
I found myself asking, as I was thinking about that appeal, whether he, in a sense, is the Bernie Sanders of Turkey. But I decided perhaps that goes too far. Let me ask you, Can, about another group of workers who are considered, of voters who are considered very, very important, namely the working class, blue-collar voters. Their sentiments have, in the past, tended to support Erdogan's party, the AKP. Where is the working class now as we see the economy plummeting?
It's such a polarized country that you cannot generalize any group, like workers, youth, women, etc. So each party has their own share from them. But we have the biggest coalition now in Turkey's history against Erdogan. So we are talking about workers, youth, Social Democrats, liberals, nationalists, soft Islamists, LGBT community, Alevis, Kurds, really amazing. We haven't seen something like this before. And the only common ground for this is, hatred of Erdogan. And they really want to have a democratic country. This is really very important, and I hope it will have an effect.
I want to come back later to what a coalition that broad means for governing later on, should he in fact win. But let me first talk a little bit about the questions that are uppermost in voters' minds, or the issues. And Dilek, it long seemed as if nothing could unseat Erdogan, but that began to change after February's earthquake and the accusations of corruption and crisis mismanagement that followed it. There was even speculation that Erdogan might put off the election because he was so concerned potentially that this would have a derogatory effect for him. How determinative do you think that the earthquake is proving in voters' minds?
I think it has been very critical indeed. I mean, the earthquake affected 11 provinces in total, and many of which are actually traditionally Erdogan's base. So these are some of these places, cities, provinces, are those that traditionally voted for Erdogan. But it was, I mean, of course, it was a very big earthquake, but what was really remarkable, I mean, what caused death, to a lot of deaths, was the utter lack of any search and rescue efforts for days. For days, there was nobody there. No one showed up. And that, of course, the contradiction of a political party which speaks about compassion, Erdogan, and being there for the poor, and this sort of, and control and power, mightiness, right? And that on the one hand, and then utter the failure of the state, basically. There was no institutions, there was nothing, and I think that really affected a lot of people, and has certainly I think we will see that in the results.
Let's take a look at another concern that many voters say is uppermost in their minds, and it's been mentioned several times: the economy. Erdogan's arbitrary and idiosyncratic policies have sent inflation skyrocketing and depressed standards of living in Turkey.
Long faces at the markets. Customers are buying less and less. The country's economy has been in free fall for years.
Alım gücümüz gerçekten çok büyük oranda
Our purchasing power has gone down.
Mesela geçen yıl ben
I used to go to that restaurant over there a lot, and the prices were okay. But now I can't afford it anymore. According to the authorities, inflation is at 43%. In reality, however, it is more than twice as high. The Turkish lira has also increasingly lost value in recent years. I have a scholarship and a student job, and it's still not enough. I can't afford doctor's visits, and I can barely make ends meet. On top of that, housing is scarce and expensive. Many Turkish people blame this on wealthy foreigners from Russia or the Arab Gulf states, as well as the 4 million refugees from Syria. The situation is particularly tense in the earthquake zones where many homes have been destroyed. Will the economic situation ruin Erdogan's presidential election?
Let me pass that question straight on to you, Yulia, if I may. In your reporting, are you witnessing rising social and economic precariousness that could impact this election?
Well, the economy is really on top of voters' minds. I mean, people have been basically seeing their savings melt away. They say they can hardly keep track of the price hikes. Nobody believes official inflation figures anymore. Independent experts say the real figure is at least twice as high, and even middle-class families tell me they find it harder and harder to afford a decent standard of living. And of course, the poor have been hit hardest because food prices for very basic staples, vegetables, for bread, have been skyrocketing in recent years. So there is a lot of frustration and anger here.
And Can, Bill Clinton famously said back in one of the elections when he was running, it's always the economy, stupid. It's always about the economy. But as we heard in that report just now, when it comes to housing, at least, many AKP voters blame foreign interests rather than Erdogan for their plight. And it seems that some polls indicate that they're doing the same when it comes to economic precariousness, that they say, no, it's not the fault of the leadership, it's the fault of outside interests. What is that? What's happening there?
It's the power of propaganda. If you follow some Turkish pro-government TVs or read newspapers, you can understand why. I mean, they are spending 5 hours in front of a TV only spreading propaganda for Erdogan. And yeah, unfortunately, that worked very well for the last decade. And they don't believe that Erdogan could lose something, all the Christian world against Turkey. And unfortunately, those media, and together with Erdogan, they made people believe in that kind of very anti-Western, anti-Christian feelings.
The opposition candidate, Kemal Kilicdaroglu, is viewed as someone who's very quiet, almost self-effacing, and absolutely focused on reconciliation. Can he really go up against that kind of disinformation and succeed, Dilek?
Well, it's an uphill battle. That's true. I mean, as John said, Erdogan has total control over the state media, public broadcasting, newspapers, etc. But then there's social media. He cannot control everything. I mean, he did attempt. He tried to close YouTube, but there's also limits to his power. Erdogan is not as mighty as Putin. So I think we also need to see that. And we were talking about the youth, Melinda. So that's why Kılıçdaroğlu is very smart, using the social media. Yulia also mentioned that. So there is a degree into which, first of all, Erdogan can continue controlling. And the second thing is, there will always be this pro-Erdogan, very consolidated base. The question then is, what is happening on the other side? What's really important is that for the first time ever, political opposition is being consolidated. And they're really breaking boundaries. Kılıçdaroğlu comes from this very secularist political party that used to advocate a very militant secularism. He's now in his coalition. They have, he's side by side by a political party that used to advocate Islamic, fundamentalism, you could say. But they are breaking all these barriers, and I'm really hopeful in terms of the unity that they're showing in leading the nation. And, Yulia's report earlier showed how for young people, a lot of these polarizations, it matters less and less because, they want a better life. They want another life. Identity politics has reached its limitations, I think, in Turkey.
So we have very few minutes left on the clock. Let me ask all of you to talk a little bit about scenarios after the election. So, Yulia, let's say that, in fact, the opposition candidate, Mr. Kilicdaroglu, wins and Erdogan doesn't take a leaf from Trump's book, but in fact concedes the election. Can the opposition coalition, which is so disparate, as we just heard from Dilek, can it really stay together and govern this very polarized, potentially fragmented country?
Well, right now, as Dilek mentioned, they are united by one common goal, right? To oust President Erdogan. But there are certainly concerns that this fragile alliance of six-party might just implode at a certain point. There has been, certainly, leading up to them announcing their joint candidate, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, there have been fights. One representative of the E-Party, the leader of the E-Party, Meral Akşener, was about to leave the table. So this is a major challenge, especially if you look at what they are vowing to do. Nothing less than fixing a broken economy, turning the system around, returning to parliamentary democracy, restore the independence of institutions. This is a huge task, a huge challenge, and it's not going to be easy for Kemal Kilicdaroglu to run the country, to govern, that's for sure.
Very quickly, Dilek, what would be the top foreign policies priorities? I asked earlier why the world should care. What would he do differently from Erdogan in 3 sentences?
He will turn his face to the West. He's going to reach out to the EU and to international institutions, to NATO, UN, etc. And really, I mean, that will be the biggest change. He already said that they're going to pursue EU, membership. I think the most important change will be that he will be open to communication and dialogue. Things will be differently. And I think it's really important that the West sees this, the importance of this.
Can, the stakes are very high. We ask in our title Erdogan's moment of truth, but in many ways this is a moment of truth for democracy itself. What happens if Erdogan stays in power?
Well, Turkey will be more autocratic, I guess, and getting more away from Europe and more close to the Putin's hands. I don't think that it will take so much time. He cannot be able to run the country anymore because, I mean, we are talking about 50% of the people against him. It won't be so easy, but it will be a kind of darkness for Turkey's future.
Thank you very much. And I just want to give you a chance to end on a more positive note. You told us you are cautiously hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, this view behind Yulia is the view I used to have from my home. So this decision of the people will determine my future as well.
Would you go home if Kilicdaroglu wins?
The next day.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Check out our YouTube site. Tell us what you think about the show.